Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Good morning or good evening, as the case may be. This is Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory on behalf of WREN. WREN stands for Working Together to Resolve Environmental Effects of Wind Energy, and WREN is a task under the International Energy Agency's Wind Committee, also known as Task 34. The goal of WREN is to facilitate international collaboration that advances global understanding of environmental effects of offshore and land-based wind energy development. And for today's webinar, we have two speakers who are going to discuss noise monitoring and research and mitigation that helps to protect marine animals, other living things in the ocean from the impacts of wind energy development related sounds. So we have two great webinars that focus on sound effects that come from both the construction and operational phase of wind energy. Next slide, yeah, thank you. Our two speakers are Brandon Southalet, who will be focusing on research to measure behavioral responses of marine mammals to various human sounds. And he's going to give us a broad introduction on marine mammal hearing and behavior, the range of effects of noise, such as that comes from wind energy development, and focus particularly on recent research and technology development of how this noise affects marine mammal behavior. Brandon will be followed by Frank Thompson from DHI in Denmark, and Dr. Thompson's presentation will look at the results of the Marvin program, which was undertaken by the EU to look at environmental effects of noise, vibration, EMF, etc. So first of all, we'll go ahead with Brandon Southalet. Now, Dr. Southalet focuses on research to measure behavioral responses of marine animals to various human sounds. He has extensive technical background in leading both applied and basic laboratory and field research programs and applying science in both international and national policies. The largest such effort involved his serving as the chief scientist for a major multi-institutional behavioral response study supported by the U.S. Navy. This looked at marine mammal responses to military sonar. Dr. Southalet also serves as technical advisor to international corporations and environmental organizations on the impact of conventional and alternate offshore energy development and also commercial shipping. I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Southalet to go ahead. Thank you.
Right. All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Don't have your slides up yet, though.
Okay, I got you. I got to stop there. All right. You got it now?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the time today. Yeah, I'm hoping to give kind of a broad introduction into the issue about how sound affects animals, the range of different types of responses that we've seen, and then I will talk specific to a research project that we're doing that involves sonar, but I'll try to make some points. There's been a lot of research in this area about how sonar affects marine mammals, and a lot of direct kind of applied studies and technology development, and I'll try to show how some of the findings from these projects are telling us about some bigger picture kind of issues that are relevant to our understanding of behavior in these animals and kind of an increasing appreciation for the complexity and the dependence of responses of marine mammals on kind of a bigger range of factors that we're starting to get our hands around. So I'll particularly focus on some of the new technologies. Let's see. Okay, I got to go this way. All right. So just at a very basic level, these animals are using sound for very important parts of their lives, and that's not just marine mammals. A lot of the focus, a lot of the research has been on marine mammals, but a wide variety of marine animals, fish, some invertebrates, use sound to find each other, to find food, to avoid predators, to find their way around. It's critical in their life history. People use sound for the same reasons. There's people that use sound directly on purpose to find things, like people that use sonar or offshore conventional energy that's looking for oil and gas, or there's sound that's produced as kind of a byproduct of building something, as in the case of offshore wind or moving a box from place to place. And a lot of the work that I do and that research and kind of the science policy interface that some of us work on are trying to answer these two questions. One is, when are there issues? And this has been a kind of contentious issue, and you can find arguments of spanning the range from, everything is a problem, and the underwater world is sort of drowning in human sound, and it's having population level effects, to the other side of there's no problem at all. And in reality, the issues are in between. There are cases where there are issues that we know about. There are things that we think are happening, but we're still getting our hands around. And then there are conditions where sound is not really a problem, and it's just kind of a background thing that animals deal with. They live in a naturally noisy world. So when are there issues is a key question. And then one of the other important things in reality is, what can we do to reduce some of these things, recognizing that many of the activities involved, like offshore energy and national security, are they involve the production of sound either on purpose or incidentally. So a lot of the work that I've done is centered around these two questions of, when are there issues and what can we do about it? Now, from a regulatory point of view, and this is a little bit U.S.-centric, but I think there are aspects of this that are universal, that we've tended to really think about a loud sound as a single event, and the received effects of it being driven almost exclusively by how loud it is, which kind of makes sense. It's how we relate to things. It's an important factor of sound. But we've done things like draw a circle around a sound source, draw a sound level, and say that something bad is going to happen at a certain point or points associated with how loud that sound is. And just from the perspective of the levels of sound, really the world is much more complex than that. There are multiple things happening simultaneously. Some things are natural that put sound in the water, like lightning and earthquakes and waves, that overlap with sounds that people put in the water, that overlap with sounds that animals put in the water. And sounds occur at different frequencies. If you think of like the keys of a piano, some of the sounds like a ship are all the way down at the left keys of the piano, and something like a pinger or like a communication device that's used between some offshore facilities, maybe at the really high end of the spectrum. And so just from this figure, you can see the world is a little bit more complicated, and things beyond just the level of the sound matter. The other thing is, if you look at sound in the ocean, the way that it travels or propagates through the environment is highly variable. So in this figure, the red is loud and the blue is quiet. You can see if you have a sound source at a couple hundred meters depth in the ocean, you get these reflections and interactions, and there are places where you can be actually relatively close to the sound source, but if you're near the surface, it might be quiet, whereas if you move farther away and you're at depth, it could be louder. So drawing simple kind of circles around sound sources doesn't really work. So there's kind of a lot on this slide, but let me just walk through the range of different kinds of effects of sound that marine animals can experience, and these are kind of increasingly bad but decreasingly present. So as I mentioned, there's a range of instances and demonstrated sound exposures where animals don't respond in any kind of observable way. These guys live in an environment that has sound in it naturally, and they may just tolerate the presence of something being there. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's not that they don't notice it, or that there might not be some kind of effects that are not detectable. But no observable response is actually a fairly common, a relatively common factor. One of the other kind of things that can occur, I'm trying to move this off my desktop there, is an interference with animals communicating with one another. So these guys, as I mentioned, use sound to interact socially. If you add sound in the same keys of that piano that they're using, you can mask or interfere with their ability to communicate. This has kind of been referred to as a loss of acoustic habitat. If you make sound loud enough, you can actually temporarily or permanently damage hearing. I put this and a couple other things in yellow that have received a lot of research attention. For many species, the levels that it takes to induce these kinds of effects are actually pretty loud, and the areas over which they may occur are quite close to sound sources. There are a few exceptions to that, animals like harbor porpoises, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in Frank's talk. But for the most part, these are relatively near to animal kind of effect. And a lot of what I'll talk about is behavioral responses. The kind of changes that we see are things like orientation or changes in vocal patterns. Some of the more important things may be effects on feeding, changes in foraging patterns or movement away from important foraging areas, social activity or risk of predation, and then really the more severe things can be things like habitat abandonment. And I know Frank will talk a little bit about some of the data on harbor porpoises and wind farms. That's some of the best data, most kind of detailed studies that have been done on offshore wind have looked at animals like harbor porpoises that have temporarily moved out of areas where wind development installation has happened. He'll also kind of get at the very different aspects of offshore wind, where the installation may include one type of disturbance, and then once the facilities are in place, it could be a very different situation, and you kind of go backwards down this chain in terms of severity. And then there are a range of physiological effects, like the increased stress hormones associated with living in highly industrialized areas, which people experience as well, and that's been demonstrated just to a small extent. We're just starting to understand things like that. Decompression sickness is another physical effect that's been studied in some of the sonar instances. So there's a whole spectrum of responses here. The most common kinds of changes that we typically see are some of the lower order behavioral responses, and then things that are continuously present, things like masking happening. The kind of permanent habitat abandonment or hearing damage in these animals is actually fairly rare, but there are some aspects of the behavioral response part of this that we're just starting to get our hands around, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about briefly with this study. And then I guess the most severe one, which has actually motivated some of the Navy studies, is the mortalities, actual stranding events, mass stranding events that have happened associated with a specific kind of sonar. That's pretty particular to that that kind of event, and has kind of motivated some of the studies of what's going on and why animals may be reacting in that way. And I'll get to it kind of in the conclusions. So there's a couple of different ways that we can measure behavior in marine mammals. We can do it experimentally, where we control the sound that animals get in like a playback scenario or a behavioral response study, which is what WREN stands for. You can do that in a lab, which gives you a lot of control, or you can do it in the field, which gives you reality, but it's a little bit harder to control. And those lab experimental methods is what I'm going to talk about in the next couple slides. The other way that you can do it, and a lot of the studies that have been done with offshore wind have not controlled the sound exposure, but have just implemented observational or opportunistic monitoring methods during ongoing activities. The benefit of that is it's the actual activity. There's not any kind of artificiality of how it's controlled, but you lose the kind of experimental design. So there's both of these methods have pros and cons. They're both being applied. A lot of the required kind of work around big-scale development it centers more on monitoring, and they clearly have their place. The experimental methods give us the ability to kind of tease apart some of the factors that I'll show you with the sonar experiments. So I'm going to try to go through this kind of quickly because I want to focus on the big picture messages that I think this study delivers. So I hope you'll bear with me, and there's some detail in some of these that I'm going to go over a little bit quickly, but it is a fairly large study. You can see some of the organizations involved. The Navy and different parts of the Navy have supported this study to measure how different whale and dolphin species, cetaceans, respond to military sonar. And you can probably tell from the organizations there's academics. We need, biologists, statisticians, underwater acousticians to kind of tackle a big project like this. So it's a multi-team, multidisciplinary partnership to try and tackle this question. And one of the big developments that's enabled us to study the behavior of marine species is the development of monitoring tools, tags, that let us track where animals are, how they dive, how they move in the water column in 3 dimensions, the kind of sounds that they make, where they're located, sounds that they're exposed to. And these tags, the ones that are shown here, are placed on marine mammals. There are some similar kinds of tags that have been put on fish. The ones that have kind of this high level of resolution, you have to get them back. So these ones are actually applied with suction cups that go onto the back of animals, and they stay on for a short period of time, on the order of hours to several days. But they give us a huge amount of rich information, and I'll show you an example of some of the data that come off of these tags that let us track where animals go. But the basic principle is put a device on these animals that let us see where they move, and these are obviously high-resolution methods. There are lower-resolution methods that can be applied on a larger number of individuals, but this was a really key development in being able to tease apart some of these aspects of behavioral response. And just some cool new developments within this project that we've done that have come out are things like being able to identify which whale is calling or which individual is vocalizing, which is actually, it sounds easy, but it's not, because whales are loud. If you want to know how many times a single individual is calling, it's actually hard to do if you just put a hydrophone in the water, because sound travels, especially low-frequency sound, travels a long way. So we figured out a couple of ways to tease apart how which individual is calling, which is actually really important for studying behavioral response. It's also important for things like density estimation. If you want to use acoustics to know how many animals are around an area, knowing how often they call is a key part of that. So in this figure, you can see this is the sound of an animal calling, and here's the acoustic waveform. But if we look at the 3D accelerometers, we can see the signal on the accelerometer that lets us know that this is this whale calling and how frequently it's calling. The other cool trick we can do is the tags have two hydrophones, and so we can look at the angle of arrival of a sound, and if it's relatively constant, it's coming from the animal that's tagged because the sensors aren't changing position relative to the animal, whereas another animal that comes in has a changing angle of arrival. So just a couple of cool technology development things that are helping us tease apart behavior and behavior response in these animals. In terms of experimental design, it's relatively simple. It's an ABA design, like a before, during, and after noise exposure design. It kind of adapts some approaches that have been applied in other places. Our goal in doing this in Southern California was to try and kind of be flexible with the animals and weather, and we're basically using a dive boat as a central platform and these rigid hull inflatables to tag animals over kind of broad areas. We use passive listening sensors. The Navy has a range off San Clemente Island that we can listen to. And a key thing of this project is we've been able to use the real sources. Now, many of these studies, including some studies of pile driving like associated with offshore wind development, have been from playbacks where you just simulate, you record a sound, and then you play it back at a lower level. And I'll give you some indication that we're seeing that the use of real is pretty critically important to understanding response. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. Basically, the sound is presented during an exposure period. We monitor animals using these tags. We use a visual focal follow procedure and position the ship so that we get a desired kind of range. That depends on how loud of a sound we can make. We've done it a couple ways. We've used this simulated sound source that's a recording, and we've used the real ship, and they're at quite different ranges. But the basic design is before, during, and after the sound exposure. And we've done this in a whole bunch of areas. You can see some of the species here. Some of these numbers might not look like a whole lot. We've, 7 beaked whales and, 3 sperm whales, but these numbers, being able to tag and track and do these experiments to, tens, many tens, 82 blue whales, 34 rhesus dolphins, this has actually been a really big effort. These are hard experiments to kind of do. So this just gives you a flavor of the species, and the distribution around LA is right here. This is Catalina Island. The Navy's range is out here. They have a monitoring training range where they use sonar. So you get an idea of the geographic location spread. Just to give you a sense of the kind of data that come off of these tags, there's a lot on here, but that's kind of the point. The top figure has the diving profile of this whale. The shaded bars when we play the sound. The receive level of the sound is presented on this axis here. And you can see the animal's behavior change during the sound exposure here. It kind of goes into this funky surface pattern and then does a deep dive after it. And we can see things like its speed picks up. It begins thinking more. This is the body acceleration, overall body acceleration moves, changes. It changes its heading so as it goes in more of a direct line. And then this bottom figure is kind of an integrated statistic that looks at change in a variety of different behaviors. And we see this increase in difference in behavior, basically, which is kind of a cluster-based statistical method. But we can look simultaneously at these and actually about 20 more parameters of behavior using these high-resolution tag methods. And using that kind of approach, we've done a number of experiments with beaked whales. The one I just showed you was one. The other two are shown here. And without going into the detail of it too much, I'll just show you that things like the blue line here shows you the animal's vocalization, which tends to stop early when we play these kind of sounds. There's a shallower ascent. There's a range of behaviors that cause this overall intensity of response to increase and decrease when we play sound to these beaked whales. That is kind of in contrast to a few examples that we have with rill ships. So we managed to get a tag on one of these offshore beaked whales, present the sound of the Navy ship to it, kind of use some tools to predict the level of sound we would get on the whale in real time, which is kind of a cool technology thing in and of itself. And the results show us some interesting things. Here's the increase of the sound level here, which actually tracks what we predicted would happen and positioning the ship in real time pretty well. But we don't see any of the kind of changes or any of the kind of vocal responses that we saw in the other case, even though the levels are about the same. And I'll just kind of wrap that into kind of an overall conclusion that we're seeing pretty big differences at this, even though the level is the same, based on the type of sound it is, if it's a simulation of something that's close to it or if it's the real that's farther away. Let me give you just a little bit more data on blue whales, and then I'll try to wrap this into some synthesis of what we think we've learned about behavior in general from these studies. So from the blue whales, we've had a much larger sample size, and we've been able to look at a variety of more detailed aspects of movement and avoidance behavior across a larger sample of individuals. And we've seen, as I mentioned before, in a lot of cases, there are no clear responses, even when the levels of sound are quite loud. This top figure up here, the sound gets over 160 decibels. For these guys, that's the equivalent of hearing something that would be 80 or 60 or 80 decibels above what they could hear would be clearly audible, a pretty loud exposure level, but no change in diving behavior or speed or surface movement in these guys. But for some individuals like this one here, even before we can measure the sound on the tag, we get these clear changes in response and in avoidance behavior. So there's something going on that isn't just how loud it is. There's similar responses across the two sound types that we've had, but the key factor here is what the animals are doing at the time is really affecting their behavior. So if we look using a component analysis kind of metric, within animals that are feeding near the surface where they have concentrated prey items and they're feeding at the surface, there's no change in their behavior. But for animals that are feeding deep on dispersed prey, there's a much stronger response. So we actually think that things like these contextual factors of behavioral state and how often they switch behavior is turning out to be really critically important. So we're looking at that a couple of different ways. One is we're looking within individuals at trying to pinpoint, are there changes that are occurring? We're doing that a couple different ways. There's some quantitative means of doing that. There's actually some recent development expert elicitation where you're asking people that really know the behavior of these animals to score changes associated with particular kinds of severity. They're looking at a host of variables that you see listed there, speed and movement and body acceleration. And you use multiple groups and kind of adjudicate those values to a single value and identify when a change happened. So in doing that, we see the same kind of pattern. For one, there's a lot of times where there's no response. So only 14 out of 36 times where we had an exposure did we score a particular response. But the majority of those came during these deep feeding scenarios. So the quantitative and the analytical kind of expert methods are telling us the same kind of things. So this last slide has a couple of key factors in it that I think bear on an important point here, and that is we see these behavioral state differences. So these are probability functions that give us the probability of response as a function of level. So within a particular case or a particular scenario, we do see an increasing probability of response with increasing level, but it depends on a couple of other factors. One is what the animals are doing. So you can see that the deep feeding animals have a sort of a steeper probability of response than shallow feeding animals. The other key thing is if you take for the same level the distance into context and how far away the animals are, the farther away the sound source is from the animal, at the same receive level, the probability of response is decreased. So the animals are able to kind of gauge where something is by factors that have to do with something other than how loud it is. And that's telling us that these contextual factors of what they're doing and the spatial proximity is really important. So wrapping this up, and then I'll give you two sort of broad summary slides and then turn it over to Frank. There are some clear species differences that we're seeing. These beaked whales, which have been more prevalent in some of the Navy stranding events, are clearly more sensitive than other species. We see that in a few different species, but of those we've tested, that's pretty clear for the beaked whales. These contextual factors of behavior and proximity look like they're as or more important than how loud the sound is, which is a little counterintuitive unless you kind of think about how you relate to sound and how you might think something is loud if you were in a library and not loud if you were at a concert. So the similar kind of factors that it's hitting on, I think. There's a lot of development in the technology and analysis and use of real Navy sonar, and one of the things that these kind of studies are going more towards is moving to broader time and space scales to use these controlled exposure methods, and we've published about a dozen papers on this work so far. But let me try to put it into some context. And we recently, or a couple years ago, proposed. There's a lot on this slide. The thing I really want you to focus on is over here. There are things with the sound that depend on how loud the background noise is, how loud what the animal's hearing threshold is itself. But equate those into the received level, perceived level by the animal, given those things from low to high. We think what we're seeing is in these kind of low to intermediate sound exposures, which is pretty common. Most sound exposures aren't really high in terms of like loud enough to hurt the animals. At the low levels, we're seeing this contextual exposures where some of these factors are mediating their probability of response beyond what the level is. And then when the sound gets loud enough, it probably does take over, and you get this dose function where the louder it is, just the more they're going to respond. But there's kind of a bimodal type of response we think that's happening in behavioral response. Okay, I'll wrap it up here with some kind of broad conclusions, and I call them new paradigms or new ways we're thinking about behavioral response. There do seem to be certain species that are clearly different. The beaked whales are particularly sensitive. The harbor porpoises, and this is particularly relevant to some of the offshore wind discussions, are more sensitive than some of the other species. Some melonhead whales may be similar. We don't have to know all of these different contextual factors, but we're getting a clear picture that things like behavioral state and when animals are feeding and they may be highly motivated to stay in an area, they may be less likely to respond to a sound and move away because of this motivation. And the proximity factor is a really, really key one that a lot of research is kind of focused on right now. Some of the behavioral factors that we're seeing, like avoidance, can be incorporated into movement models that predict exposure. A lot of the mitigation rules and the assessment of response involve predicting where animals are and how they're exposed. And we've only started to incorporate some of these kinds of data from behavioral response to improve those models. So that's an area of improvement that these things are kind of driving. There's an effort called the Population Consequences of Disturbance that is a very active field of research that not only just looks at the severity of response, but tries to put the consequences, what it means in terms of energetics and survival into place, and that's an important area. This is kind of a U.S.-centric one, but broadly, and the folks in Europe have done a better job, and we're kind of catching up a little bit, using methods that are more risk-based, risk assessment, looking at incorporating uncertainty and not just using this term of take or predicting how many animals are exposed, but what do these things mean biologically? And then the last thing, and I think this is particularly relevant to practical operations, is some of these complexities to evaluating the probability of response are necessary and important for regulatory assessments of potential impact. But what you do in the field, the rules that people have when they have to shut something down or put a bubble curtain in place or when they have to do something, those things have to remain simple, and they can't track this level of complexity. And then I just have a kind of a final closing slide here, which is we're thinking more broadly about these things. We've often just kind of dealt with one loud thing at a time, and we're realizing that the world is bigger and there's multiple things overlapping, and a lot of the kind of management considerations have gone from a single activity to looking at categories of activities and overlapping areas of activity. And I think our ability to understand some of those things build up from understanding the nature of individual responses and response probability, and some of the work that we're doing is trying to feed into some of these things, looking at broader time and space scales. So I think I've probably taken a little bit more of my time, but you'll hear some more specific details on some of these things from Frank's talk, and then we could come back to some of the broader picture issues in some of the questions. So I think at this point I will pass it back over to Frank and let him pick it up from here.
Thank you, Brandon. That was just great. And while Frank's getting ready, I just want to introduce him. Frank Thompson is a senior marine scientist and business development manager at DHI in Denmark. He has specialized in the design and implementation of noise-related impact studies and forecasts, as well as detailed noise risk assessments for a variety of activities, ranging from construction and design of offshore wind parks to impacts from shipping. Dr. Thompson has extensive experience advising international bodies such as the UN, OSPAR, and the EU on noise effects. Frank Thompson earned his PhD working on the whistles of wild killer whales in British Columbia at Hamburg University in Germany. And he's going to talk with us today particularly about the Marvin project. So please go ahead, Frank.
Yes, thanks, Andrea, for the very nice introduction. I'm going to talk about Marvin today, and Marvin is in short for Marine Renewables, Vibrations, Energy, Electromagnetic Emissions, and Noise. And it took us a long time to come up with a very good name, but what we thought is we're all fans of The Hitchhiker's Guide Through the Galaxy, the book by Douglas Adams, and it's also the name of the manic depressive robot from that book series. So we thought it's a particularly cool name for a project. Anyways, Marvin was done by DHI in conjunction with other institutes in Europe. In fact, 8 other institutions, from Cranfield University in the UK to DD in Germany. And the background on this was that water, as Brandon said, is really an excellent medium for sound transmission. Sound is more than 4 times faster underwater compared to air, and there's much less attenuation. So sound travels really far underwater, and the impacts can be also consequently far-ranging. Now, there are a variety of sound impacts. I don't want to go to that into much more detail because Brandon has introduced in the topic already. There can be audibility, masking, responsiveness, or mortal injury, depending roughly on how far the receiver or the animal is with regards to the sound source. Now, if we look at marine renewables, that's a topic that is really important in Europe. And marine renewables can be put into different categories. Here above the picture is offshore wind farms, and in the middle you got a wave converter, and then a tidal energy converter. Now, with regards to the latter two, there's less development in Europe so far, but it's coming. But for offshore wind farms, there's quite a bit of ambitious plans. You can see this map here on the right. This is the southern North Sea. This is England, British coast. and the channel here, and these brown areas denote to around 3 offshore wind farm sites, and these are sites where offshore wind farms are being planned or actually being built. And here in Germany, in the German exclusive economic zone, you can see also a lot of potentially, and in fact also already built areas where offshore wind farms are being built. So if there's a problem for marine life due to noise exposure, it will be something of relatively large spatial scales. Now, there have been reviews on the topic since the start of 2000, 2002 or so, when the first studies were done, and when the issue of renewables became apparent in Europe. In 2006, there were benchmark papers published on impacts of noise from offshore renewables on marine mammals and fish. And now, actually about 8 years later, the European Commission, which funded that study, the Directorate for Research and Innovation, thought really it's time to take stock. It's time to just stop now and to survey all the information we have and review the information. So one of the Marvin objectives was to critically review the available scientific evidence and significance of impacts of noise, vibrations, and electromagnetic emissions. And in my talk, I will only talk about noise. And then, based on these to form field measurements to fill gaps in knowledge. And then finally, based on these two parts, to make recommendations for further research priorities. And we had basically 18 months for doing that, so it's not a very long time, and the budget was 1 million euro for that. Now, when we came out with talking about how we want to approach this study, we thought we really wanted to follow a risk-based approach in terms of the reviews and summarizing the state of knowledge. And this risk-based approach talks you or goes through different steps from really identifying what is the problem, what can happen basically to marine life in terms of noise exposure, then how far does the sound spread and how many animals are in range of the sound. This is usually done by identifying the sound source and making some kind of noise modeling from the source out to a certain distance. And then, to investigate how do animals react to the sound. This is basically what Brandon talked a lot about, is this what we call the dose response assessment. And then if you have identified a problem, or if you found a significant problem, then you have to do something about that. So we also reviewed in this study the different studies that have been concerned with mitigating sound impacts. And I will talk you through some of the highlights of the review. Now, from offshore wind farm noise, our review basically concluded that, or confirmed previous investigations. We know that construction sounds, when impact pile driving is involved, comes with very high sound pressure levels, more than 250 decibels relative to 1 micropascal at 1 meter. These are all estimates, and it's very difficult to compare these values to in-air values, but it's quite intense sound for pile driving operations. So marine construction using that particular technology, which is usually used in wind farm construction, at least in Europe, is quite intense. Now, during operation, there's much lower levels of sound. There are between 114 or so and 130 decibel relative to 1 micropascal inside the offshore wind farm area. So this is lower than a shipping sound. So the suspected impacts during operation might be much less than during construction. Now, when we talk about noise impacts, we want to first look at how far the animals can actually hear the sound. And this is basically still from a review that I published in 2006. On the x-axis, you got the frequency, and on the y-axis, the sound pressure level, the intensity of the sound and decibels. And you can see here this blue line is basically it's a very schematic overview of ambient sound. And then these two, the black and the green line, denote to the hearing course of harbor porpoise and the herring, respectively. And you can see that hearing and harbor porpoises goes from very low frequencies, very little sensitivity or poor sensitivity, down to 100 kilohertz, where the porpoise hears really well, extremely well actually, and then hearing sensitivity decreases. And if you superimpose the pile driving spectrum, which is the frequency sounds at 1 meter and our calculations at 80 kilometer, you can see that the pile driving sound is still above ambient sound, and still above what the animals can, their hearing course. So we concluded at that time that pile driving signals will be audible to porpoises and to herring at least 80 kilometer distance from the source. So if there's an impact or behavioral impact or other impacts that could occur in relatively large, or the area where anything could occur could be large. Now in the study we also modeled based on the reviews we performed modeling, which is shown here in an overview, 2 graphs showing the coast of Belgium, an offshore wind farm site in the center here. And this white areas is actually where the sound is not above ambient any longer, and the red areas here in the center show where the sound of a pile driving operation in this case is still above ambient sound. So what we did is we kind of redone this modeling that was previously done with more sophisticated models to investigate in this what we call the acoustic footprint for pile driving. How far is the sound above ambient sound, also with respect to the hearing of the animals? And we did that for 3 sediment types in different pile diameters. And we could conclude actually that the zone is of course depending on sediment and the pile diameters. Roughly speaking, with larger pile diameters, the acoustic footprint is larger than with smaller pile diameters. Now, the really novel thing was that we also looked at operational wind farms. And what we did there was looking at the cumulative footprint from more than one wind farm in terms of sound, because there was this kind of suspicion that sounds from different wind farms would superimpose over one another and the impact ranges would get larger. But that wasn't so. Here in the middle, the sound levels from dark red from 3 offshore wind farm projects in the wind farm area. You can see there is an acoustic footprint there, but then really the sound spreads only to a few kilometers from sound source. So overall, even if you have more than one offshore wind farm, the acoustic footprint is rather low. Now, behavior response, Brandon has mentioned his fabulous studies he does, and in Europe we have more experience with other species, mainly with the harbor porpoise and with the harbor seal. And by reviewing all the information that was visible to us at that time, 1 year ago the study was finished, we found that, or we can pretty much conclude that for harbor porpoises there's a decrease in acoustic activity and an indication of avoidance from a wind farm operation at least 20 kilometers, or at 20 kilometers from the source. And this is confirmed for more or less 6 sites. So it's actually common knowledge now in Europe that impact pile driving will result in really quite large scales of avoidance for this species, which is very common. Whereas during operation the results are equivocal. We have positive responses where porpoises are more abundant in the wind farm area than before wind farm was there. We have negative responses in 1 case in Denmark and no documented effects in 3 other cases. Now for harbor seals, there's not so many studies. There have been very recent studies now showing potential for TTS from pile driving. But what we found is there were studies that observed changes in haul-out behavior and indication of avoidance, and during operation there was no effect, but very little studies, of course. Only 1 study that we came across. Now, if we look at these behavioral impacts, it's clear that harbor porpoises would react at large distances. But what about TTS, temporary threshold shift, temporary hearing loss? Now, what you have to consider in this context is the noise dose concept, and this is shown here graphically. If we calculate the impact range for TTS using criteria from the literature and out to a certain distance, we would think that, or we would conclude that for pile driving, for single strike pile driving, the impact range for TTS would be 700 meters. And again, this is only an example, but what really happens is that there are many more than 1 strikes, of course, and if the animal doesn't move, it's exposed to much more sound, of course, that adds up. So consequently, the impact ranges gets, in theory, much larger. And if you do the same calculation using the same transmission loss formula and calculate for the impact range for 1 hour, you would conclude that the porpoise would be exposed at a distance of more than 12 kilometers for TTS. But this is based on an assumption, and you have to be paying some attention now because you can see that the animal is actually moving. The animal is actually moving. I see the notes here. Actually, I have to remove them a little bit, put them on the side. The animal moved out of the picture, and this is really important. In Europe, there's a very strong discussion now about animal movements in impact assessments, because this is what animals do. They move constantly in response to environmental variables and to pressures, for example, underwater sound. So that porpoise might have moved out of the impact zone by the time the full force of the impulsive sounds hits him. So at the moment, we are kind of very busy developing actually models to incorporate animal movements in these noise risk assessments. Now, with regards to fish and wind farms, yeah, we can conclude that many fish species are very sensitive to sound. And what we found also, what you can say is that offshore wind farm sound can lead to death of fish close to the sound and to behavior reactions, at least potentially, far from the construction site. And there are now 2 investigations that point to that. One was done by, while I was still in my previous job at CFAS in 2010, we published this. And what we did is we played back pile driving sound through an underwater speaker in net pens, very large net pens in a Scottish bay, and we found reactions of cod and sole to this pre-recorded pile driving sound at relatively low levels of exposure. And very recently, a colleague of mine, Tony Hawkins, did a very nice investigation with actually in the field with free-moving fish, and he observed their reaction to impulsive sound using echo sound sonar, and he could found that the school would react to this impulsive sound. So there is indication that fish will react behaviorally to impulsive sound, which pile driving is an impulsive sound as well. Now, what we have to consider in fish, and which is really a key point in Marvin, is actually that fish is not so sensitive to pressure. Fish senses different things. The sound wave is composed of sound pressure, but also of the movement of the particles in the sound wave, the particle acceleration or velocity, and this is what we call particle motion. This is just because the fish ear, or the way the sound reaches the fish ear is slightly different in fish compared to marine mammals and in fact humans as well. So many fish are actually only sensitive for particle motion, and they're not sensitive for the pressure. A flatfish, for example, like here, would be only sensitive to particle motion, and a herring would be sensitive more or less to sound pressure because he has a swim bladder and accessory organs to actually detect pressure. And this was really important when guiding the field work. But just to wrap up the reviews, we also looked at risk management, and there are actually quite a bit of new developments on how to dampen sound. I don't want to go into much more detail with the sound management, but just to mention that in pile driving there are now basically 2 or 1 type, shown here on the right, is used most commonly, and this is a noise mitigation system involving shielding the pile from putting air between the pile and the water. You can do that by emitting air bubbles. We call that a bubble curtain, or you can do that by a steel tube around the pile driver, and you suck or you pump the water out of that. The sound is totally reflected there and is dampened. And this noise mitigation system, which has been in operation in the southern North Sea at several wind farm sites, here shown on the right, is very widespread, and bubble curtains are also used. And these kind of new technologies to mitigate sound reduce the sound quite substantially, depending on circumstances, of course. But they are also really expensive. So there's a cost-benefit analysis involved here. Now, based on this review, and I mentioned particle motion, we came up with priorities for the field work. And we basically said that really one of the priorities for Marvin should be particle motion, measurement of particle motion during operation at an offshore wind farm and wave device site. So that was really one of the goals, because that was a missing link. Then we also wanted to do EMF measurements, but I don't want to go into detail here. But the third point is important. We were interested in particle motion during construction. We found that the literature on sound pressure, as I said earlier, is quite substantial, indicating actually that sound levels are very high, or sound pressure levels are very high. But what about particle motion, that thing that fish detects? How high is that? And we went about to find that out. Now, initially, and in a study like that, actually, we had to change plans almost on a, I should say, almost on a daily basis. Originally, we had, and this is a map of our study area. It's all over Northern Europe, basically. Initially, we had planned for several sites, and we came up actually with some of the sites that we initially planned where we did the measurements. Other sites had to be anew. So we measured a wind farm during operation in Belgium. And this is shown here in the middle. The arrow here in the middle off the Belgian coast. We measured wave and tidal. We measured a tidal operation at the Isle of Wight in the south here of England, the so-called Plato device. Then we went to Sweden and measured a wave energy converter and the Lyseskill wave energy converter off the coast of Sweden, and then also a wave converter located off Scotland in Keithorn. So we had 2 wave energy converters. So quite a different array of sites, 5 sites spread out, and I will talk about the highlights from each of these measurement campaigns. Now, the Swedish wave energy converter was a particularly interesting device. It's shown here on the right. You've got this machine, which is basically the generator, which sits in 20 meters of water, or 23 meters of water, and then you get this kind of string here, and then you get this floating device, and that floating device looks a little bit like a swimming pool at the surface within the big pool, the sea, and it moves up and down, and this is how the energy is converted and produced actually. So we performed measurements with an institution from FOI, a particle motion sensor at the seafloor. We also measured the sound pressure, so we could do both, 23 meters distance from the device. And we did 7 days recording, and I have to correct myself. The device was, it was in about 25 meters of water, and 25 meter water depth. And in this video we will play back now, you can see one of our team members rolling into action, and that's Matthias Andersen from FOI. And what you will see in a second when the video comes up is the particle motion sensor that FOI developed. Now, this particle motion sensor is really special. It's a device. It's a very heavy device you deploy in the water, and then you've got a cable and a sphere. And the sphere is actually on top and floats freely in the water column. And this is where the sound, or the particle motion in this case, a part of the sound wave is recorded. And you can see Matthias delivering that. And you can see the sphere nicely floating up. The whole idea is that it has to be completely passive. Otherwise, of course, we would not record the particle motion, but we would record rather the wave movements around the device. So that was a very big discussion we had in the group, that we actually wanted to avoid recording just wave movements and not the particle motion from the wave energy converter. So I think I'm back in the presentation now. Just the results now. The results were particularly interesting with regards to the differences of particle motion and sound pressure. What we found was that the sound pressure was not detectable for fish. When we looked at the audiograms, what fish can hear at 23 meter distance, so in the near field, but supposedly also a little bit further away. But the particle motion was, and this is shown here, the blue line is the wave energy converter particle acceleration as measured. Then you've got the green line here in the middle. This is the ambient sound, the ambient particle motion. It's all in particle motion units. And then the hearing curves for cod, salmon, and plaice. And you can see that this is above ambient sound and above their hearing in these lower frequencies. So interestingly enough, the fish would not detect the sound pressure, but they would detect the particle motion. Now, the tidal device measurements were performed, as I said, in South England and in Keithorn. The South England device was particularly fancy. It's like a really giant propeller, or 2 giant propellers underwater. And we performed these measurements with a drifting device, which we also developed particularly for this project, to just rule out also that we are measuring from a fixed platform and would record actually ambient wave movements rather than sound. And we found that a signal that was quite tonal and in the low to mid frequency range, and it was quite sufficiently above ambient sound, 10 to 15 dB, and at 280 meters from the sound source. Now, let's move to the particle motion. The particle motion measurements were done at the very last minute of the study, I should say, back in May 2015, last year, and they were pioneering, as I said. Again, you can see the device here on the left, the particle motion device from FOI, and we measured particle motion with the noise mitigation system, with the bubble or with a steel tube around the pile driver with an associated bubble curtain and without. And you can see that here below in that graph. This is a timeline from 10 o'clock in the evening to 4 o'clock in the morning, and you can see these kind of different situations where we did the measurements. And when the pile driver was on and it was unmitigated, it was pretty energetic when it comes to particle motion. So we found that there were very high levels of particle motion. They were, of course, detectable by fish at 750 meters from the pile driving, but that was the measurement distance we had. They're supposedly detectable further away. But they were also really significantly mitigated by this noise mitigation system and the bubble curtain at this distance, showing actually that these mitigation systems work also for particle motion, not only for sound pressure. So to summarize the Marvin study, the review concluded that we have progress in sound source calculations and modeling techniques in recent years. So I think we have a pretty good grip on the sound pressure and from pile driving, and we can say that impact pile driving comes with quite loud or intense sound levels. Now, for the behavioral response, they're only tested in a very few species, and knowledge on effects on other species and taxa is really sparse. And for the risk management, actually, there is quite a bit of progress there with regards to risk mitigation, especially for impact pile driving. Now, for measurements, Marvin was able to provide new results on particle motion and sound pressure levels from operating wave and tidal devices. And we should say that we come up with, I think, groundbreaking results for particle motion from pile driving. Now, how is this used in future research priorities? Of course, Marvin couldn't answer all the questions, but I think we have a good idea what can be future roads ahead with regards to further R&D priorities. The team really believes that with regards of dose response, pile driving effects of fish, invertebrate species of commercial conservation importance and/or ecosystem functions, for example, herring or cod, and perhaps also how these effects are translated into population-level consequences are really important, because we know that, for example, in Europe, porpoises, marine mammals are affected at 20 kilometers. We know nothing about fish, or not very much about fish, and yet we have a lot of fish, and many of their spawning areas, for example, with regards to herring, are located very close to prospective offshore wind farm sites. So I think we have to have a close look at that issue. Then, with regards to dose response, we think that a priority should be given to pile driving noise effects on baleen whales, large baleen whales like humpback whales or blue whales or fin whales, but only, of course, in areas where wind farms spatially overlap with the distribution range of the taxa. This is not so much in Europe, or at least in many waters where offshore wind farms are built in Europe, but in the US, if you look at the East Coast, you got areas where there's northern right whales, humpback whales, and all these what we call low-frequency cetaceans, and pile driving sound is low frequency. So we have to have a look at that issue. And then, of course, exposure assessment. What about sediment vibration due to construction of MRADs? I was not going into detail, but there is a different path of sound. Some of the sound find its way through the sediment rather than the water column, and it would be worth having a look at that. So that's it. That's all I had to say. This is the Marvin team from the different institutions at the final project meeting in beautiful Villanova in Spain, and if you want to have a look at the final report, it's downloadable from the TETHIS webpage, but you can also download it if you can actually remember this very, very long link. But of course, you can also contact me at DHI. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Frank. That was just great. Now, I don't know if we've had any questions come in. We've got a couple here, but if the participants would like to go ahead and type any questions in and also indicate sort of who they're for, that would be great. So just to wrap up a little bit before we get into Q&A, this is the 7th webinar that WREN has had, and each has sought to offer perspectives from multiple nations where many of us are in different countries are trying to look at very similar issues, be it offshore wind or land-based wind. We will have another webinar this summer in the 3rd week of July that will be looking at a large aerial assessment of coastal waters in advance of offshore wind. And if you are on our webinar list, you'll get an email to that effect. If you're not on our webinar mailing list, please just send a blank email to this email address here, jointethyswebinars@laris.pnnl.gov. And all our webinars and associated presentations are archived on TETHIS. It takes us a few days to get the slides and the audio up, but those will be up shortly. Next slide, please. So thank you for attending today, and we are looking forward to your questions. If you have any questions about WREN, please contact any of the three of us, Karen Sinclair at NREL, myself, or Jocelyn Brown-Sarancino at the Department of Energy. So with that, I think we'll move to some questions. I've got a couple of questions here first for Brandon. In your discussion of looking at separating out individual whale responses, both understanding which whale is talking and what its response to a sound might be, do you try to correlate those responses to characteristics of the individual, for example, age, gender? Do they sound different if they're male or female, older or younger?
Yes, that's a good question. Yes is the answer. There are some, depending on the kind of sound and the species. So there are certain species where only males will sing, display kind of vocalizations. Things like echolocation sounds tend to be more similar between sexes, but may differ some based on body size. So animals that are larger, generally speaking, tend to have lower frequency components to them. So there are definitely there are species differences, and then there are some characteristic differences that we can pick up on within the context of response. We think there probably are some differences that depend on factors like that as well. We're just kind of at the infancy of being able to tease these things apart. I mean, it's only because we've had 40 individual blue whales that we've been able to start to pull apart things like these behavioral state differences. So there probably are sex and age class differences in the probability of response too, but we're kind of just getting to the beginning of addressing some of those as well.
Great, thank you. So we have a question here for Frank. Could you elaborate more on the effects observed in fish between sound level and particle motion exposure? And were any effects observed from the sound pressure levels?
Yeah, it's a good question, but difficult to answer, because you don't know actually precisely what the stimulus is, because basically it depends what you record. Of course, just to give you an example, in the study that we did back in 2010, we recorded both particle motion and sound pressure, and we found reactions at relatively low sound pressure levels, and if I remember it right, also relatively low particle motion levels. But of course, that was a little bit of an artificial setup because we had a speaker. Now, we had also species that were only sensitive to particle motion, the sole, and cod. And cod is sensitive to both, depending on frequencies. So it's complicated, and you have to look at the details. So I think we can say that we found reactions in sole, and due to the exposure, and since they're only sensitive to particle motion, they were reacting to the particle motion. Now for cod, it's a little bit more complicated because we found a startle response in the species, so they were actually kind of stopping, but we don't really know if that was due to the particle motion or the sound pressure level, because we didn't really, we recorded both, right? And so it's not so clear.
Great, thank you. So another question, I think this may be for Frank also, but maybe Brandon would like to weigh in. In practical terms, it sounds as if the concerns about pile driving around the dolphins and porpoises, harbor porpoise, may be decreased, and that in Europe it may be easier to move forward with installing offshore wind if there are porpoises around, and that we really do need to focus our efforts on these larger low-frequency whales. Is that fair to say?
You mean in Europe or?
Well, starting in Europe and then what we can learn here in the U.S. I think that's the gist of the question.
Yes and no. I mean, there are site-specific things, of course. I mean, I think that Marvin was a little bit, I can speak from a Marvin point of view, and it was all about prioritizing issues and closing down issues where we have knowledge. So I think the issue of impact pile driving and porpoises is pretty clear. So I think that to answer the question, yes, I think there are different topics now, and we suspect that we don't know the hearing of large whales. As to my knowledge, there's no audiogram, but we suspect that they're sensitive in these lower frequencies. They are perhaps more sensitive than a harbor porpoise to these low-frequency pile driving, where most energy is. So I think it's an issue that we should look at, especially when it comes to behavioral reaction. There are plans to build offshore wind farms off the U.S. coast, and they are built right near critical habitat. So a risk assessment has to look at that. Now, you don't know how severe a behavioral reaction is. That's of course a very important point to consider here. But I think it's an issue that should be investigated.
Great, thank you. Brandon, do you have anything to add to that as we think about offshore wind on the Atlantic coast with the large whales there?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's clearly something that's motivated some of the monitoring that's happening around Block Island in the U.S. Some of the folks from the University of Rhode Island have done some acoustic monitoring that's certainly cognizant of the right whale critical habitat and humpback whale distribution. Frank's right, we don't have the kind of hearing data that we have for other species where we can bring them into the laboratory and do the kind of tests that we do with, human children and other kind of animals to measure how they hear. That, the whales are just kind of too big for that. But there's been a fair amount of anatomical modeling and, data from the kind of sounds that they produce and the kind of sounds that they're probably sensitive to suggest that, there really are low-frequency specialists. They're probably, using and sensitive to these kinds of sounds. I think the data that we have from the laboratory on harbor porpoise specifically, and in contrast with other marine mammal species like bottlenose dolphins, like some of the work that I'm actually involved in with harbor seals and ice seals at a lab here in California, is showing as part of probably why porpoises are a little more behaviorally sensitive. The hearing thresholds tend to be lower than some of the other species. The thresholds for sounds that they're affected to in terms of their hearing is are lower than some of the other species by kind of a lot. So I think, we're kind of, as Frank said, kind of compartmentalizing some of this and realizing that, that where you have these particularly sensitive species like harbor porpoise, when there's the installation component, there are going to be disturbances and temporary avoidance of areas that people are working out what those things mean, and I think they're still important, and those effects can be meaningful. But then, some of these other species, the data we're getting from the labs are telling us, they're probably not going to, the zones over which you can actually hurt them with sound are probably quite a bit smaller, and so it does reduce, I think, the level of concern of some of these direct impacts in some other species, and it does mean the ones that are on the same keys of the piano, if you will, which the whales are ones that we need to look at a little bit more, as well as animals like like seals that also hear in the low frequencies.
Great, thank you. So for Frank, what's the maximum sound level we get during pile driving according to recent research, and should this be SVL or SEL based?
Well, I assume that's a question about impacts. If you look at I mean, the maximum level is depending on circumstances, and as I said, depending also on pile diameter. And this is all back calculated. There are no measurements of pile driving at the source because it's just not possible. What you do is you measure them at a certain distance out, and you back calculate what you think the sound level is at 1 meter. And these recent investigations, it's around 250, 257 peak levels. Now, if you look at the exposure or the disturbance, I would always opt for a dual criterion, like Brandon in his paper, composed of a peak threshold and an SEL, which both say different things. Peak is good for describing inputs of sound, but sound exposure level is good for the description of the energy, which is of course important.
Great. So a question for Brandon. Was there any indication that any of the species in the BRS studies were less successful feeding during or after sound exposure?
Yes. We saw changes in feeding, particularly in the cases where animals were feeding deep in the water column. But we can quantify that in terms of the reduction in the number of lunge attempts. So, how successful animals are is, is something that, it depends on what they're feeding on and the concentration and everything. But at least in terms of the feeding effort, we can quantify those changes and, measured reductions in feeding behavior, which was typically just associated with animals just moving away. So the cases where there were those kinds of responses, they would stop feeding and move away from an area, and then they resume it, pretty quickly after the sound goes away. So temporary changes in feeding in not all of the cases, but some of them, where we could measure the reduction in foraging.
Great, thank you. Now we have another question for Frank on fish. What can you tell us about early life stages of fish, larval and juveniles versus the adults, with respect to effects of particle motion?
A little bit, and the information is a bit sparse. I mean, there has been an investigation in Dutch waters, or from Dutch researchers. They exposed larval of, if I remember right, sole to inputs of sound, and they didn't find any effects at pretty high levels of exposure. That was an issue that was thought to be a problem for larvae due to injury. So the suspicion here was that larval stages would be exposed to relatively large high amounts of particle motion, and they would be injured or destroyed. And that really didn't happen at very large or comparably large exposure levels.
Great. Okay. I think that's all the individual questions we have at this point. So I think we're going to bring this webinar to a close. This has been a really useful set of presentations, and I would like to thank our speakers and also thank all of you for participating. This concludes the webinar. Thank you.